Welcome to Question of the Week. This is a Facebook Live session where I take on your science faith questions. This week's question comes from several of you who have sent me links to popular Science in the News articles that deal with the discovery of 200,000-year-old human remains in Israel. And the question, of course, is this: what do these discoveries mean? What do these discoveries mean for the Christian faith? And do these discoveries undermine the reasons to believe human origins model that is based on a biblical understanding of human origins? So I'm going to take on those questions and maybe even more in just a minute. But before I do that, I would like to remind all of you who are watching to take a moment and to check in. Say hi. Let us know who you are and where you're watching from. This is valuable information as we plan future broadcasts, but it's also a way for me to get a chance to know you just a little bit better. Also, if you're watching this broadcast, react to it with the like button. This is very helpful to us because it helps us to increase the visibility of this broadcast in the Facebook stream. That means you're helping us to get the message out. You're helping more people to engage this very important question regarding human origins. And then finally, I'd like to know what you think about this discovery and about human origins in general. Offer me your perspective in the comment section, even if it disagrees with my viewpoint. Okay, without any further ado, let's go ahead and jump into this discovery. This discovery is based on a paper published in the journal Science. In fact, it's the January 26th, 2018 edition of the journal Science, with an international team of collaborators that report on the recovery and the characterization of a partial mandible and some teeth recovered in Mount Carmel in the northern part of Israel. And in the popular science articles, the claim is that these fossil remains are 200,000 years in age and that they are modern humans, meaning that modern humans made their way out of Africa much earlier than anybody would have thought, maybe 50 to 150,000 years earlier than previously thought. And of course, the question is, what does this mean when it comes to a biblical understanding of human origins? Does this discovery threaten the RTB human origins model that, again, is based on a traditional biblical understanding of human origins? Well, the reason why people raise that question, why the concern is that this discovery may again undermine a biblical understanding of human origins, can be understood when we think about what that model entails and some of the scientific evidence that we have pointed to at Reasons to Believe that offer support for a biblical understanding of human origins. The traditional biblical view is that humanity originates from a primordial pair, an Adam and an Eve, that were created through God's direct personal intervention, creatures that were uniquely made in His image, that all of humanity descends from this primordial pair, and that humanity began its populating of the globe by migrating at or near the Middle East, fanning outward again to populate the surface of the planet. Now, for many people, they would view this creation account as just a Hebrew myth, as a mythical description of the origin of humanity that maybe has theological significance, but doesn't really have real historical or scientific credibility. But at Reasons to Believe, we would actually argue that while we cannot necessarily provide direct scientific support for this idea, we can show that some of the latest ideas in anthropology, ideas generated even in the context of an evolutionary origin of humanity, actually support a biblical understanding of human origins. So, for example, when it comes to genetic variability, by sampling genetic variability of people around the world, we can show using mitochondrial DNA as a genetic marker, that humanity traces its origin back to a single sequence that many people think corresponds to a single female individual, a mitochondrial Eve. The genetic variability with the Y chromosomal data traces an origin back to a single ancestral sequence that many people think corresponds to a single male individual, a mitochondrial Eve and a Y chromosomal Adam. And the genetic data seems to indicate that mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosomal Adam lived at the same time, roughly speaking, in the 130 to 140,000 year regime. And that they must have emerged from a relatively small population. And so this is consistent, this harmonizes with a biblical perspective on human origins. When we look at the archaeological record as an indication of when sophisticated human behavior appears, the data increasingly indicates that it appears very close to the time that the genetic evidence seems to indicate that humanity originated, in the 140,000 year regime. When we look at the fossil record, we see that a preponderance of modern human fossils appear in the 40,000 year time range, and that we have what are called near anatomically modern humans that appear or persist till about 200,000 years ago. So presumably somewhere in that window of time, we would see the emergence of modern humans. And so the fossil record, which is rather sparse, the archaeological record, which is more robust, and the genetic evidence all seem to coincide with an origin of anatomically and behaviorally modern humans from a single location, East Africa, thousands of years ago, not a couple of million years ago. And again, in the migration patterns of humanity presumably begin about 50 to 60,000 years ago and begin to span and fan outward around the world, also harmonizing in a broad sense with what we see in the Genesis 10 account of the spread of humanity. So the point is that while the scientific evidence may not necessarily provide direct proof of the biblical narrative, it harmonizes with the biblical narrative and is suggestive that the biblical narrative has scientific and historical credibility from a natural history standpoint. But this is where now this discovery of this fossil specimen from Israel plays into this analysis, because this discovery seems to indicate that modern humans were in Israel 200,000 years ago, which is earlier than we would have argued modern humanity appears based on the genetic evidence and the archaeological evidence for behaviorally modern humans. And it also is in a location that is outside of Africa, with the idea that humanity migrated out of Africa even earlier than we thought, that modern humans originated earlier than we thought and migrated out of Africa earlier than we thought. And couple this discovery with the announcement of the Jebu Irhoud specimen in Morocco that was claimed at one point to be a modern human at 300,000 years ago, or the discovery of the Florisbad man in South Africa that dates about 250,000 years ago, or the Homo sapiens Idaltu specimen, the Hirtu man in Ethiopia about 200,000 years ago, or Homo kabish, again about 200,000 years ago, or the skull and the Kafsa specimens in the caves in Israel about 170,000 years ago. And these discoveries, which some people interpret as being modern humans, seem to suggest that humanity originated earlier than 130 to 140,000 years ago, but instead of originating in a single location, humanity's origin was actually dispersed across the African continent. So it happened much earlier, and that it's a diverse location for humanity's origin. Again, across the African continent, where these populations begin to coalesce to give rise to modern humans about 150,000 years ago. This is how evolutionary biologists, interpret these results, and this is why people argue that this represents a challenge to the RTB model for human origins, in fact, to the biblical model of human origins. But is this really the case? Well, I've spent some time reading very carefully this article published, again, in Science, that is the basis for these claims that come from this international team that has made its way into Science in the News pieces. And careful assessment of this article actually indicates that this partial mandible and the teeth specimens that were discovered in the Mount Carmel cave in Israel are not anatomically modern humans whatsoever, but instead they are what anthropologists would call near anatomically modern humans. So let me spend some time kind of dissecting what I just said. Okay, from an evolutionary perspective, and we're going to think about this now from an evolutionary perspective, and then we'll bring in a biblical perspective in a few minutes. From an evolutionary perspective, the argument is that Neanderthals and modern humans share a common ancestor, about 500,000 to 700,000 years ago, and that this ancestor, maybe Homo heidelbergensis or some creature like this, gave rise to two lineages, one culminating with Neanderthals, one culminating with modern humans. And the idea is that by analyzing the mandible and the teeth, these researchers concluded that the characteristics were not like that of Neanderthals. And Neanderthals would have been in Israel about 200,000 years ago. So the argument is that these are not Neanderthals, are not part of the Neanderthal lineage. And when they analyze the teeth anatomy, it does seem to cluster in what they would call the Homo sapien clade. But when you read the paper in detail, it's very clear that there are features of these teeth that indicate that they were not that of anatomically modern humans, but rather creatures that anthropologists would call near anatomically modern humans. Some would call them archaic Homo sapiens. Some would call them early modern humans. These are different names given to these creatures, but they're not anatomically modern humans. Moreover, the archaeological evidence at that site was Middle Paleolithic. It was Mousterian, meaning it was the type of artifacts that Neanderthals would have made, not the type of artifacts that behaviorally modern humans would have made. In other words, these creatures would be distinct from anatomically and behaviorally modern humans. And when anthropologists use the term Homo sapien, you have to understand as a layperson what they mean by that term. There's confusion about how anthropologists use terms like humans and Homo sapiens and how we would use those terms in a normal everyday conversation. When we use the term human, we use a scientific moniker Homo sapiens, we're referring to us, people like us. When an anthropologist uses that term, human refers to any creature that is a primate that walks erect. That would include the Australopithecines, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Neanderthals. These would all be considered to be human. And the term Homo sapiens is not referring to modern humans that are anatomically and behaviorally modern humans. That would be Homo sapiens sapiens. Homo sapiens is referring to creatures that would have existed in the neighborhood of 300,000 to about 150,000 years ago, that would have archaic features in terms of their facial structure, in terms of the shape of their head, in terms of the shape of their brain, and things like that. That they were a distinct species, anatomically and behaviorally, from anatomically modern humans and behaviorally modern humans. And in fact, this creature in Israel falls into that classification. Moreover, the Jebu Irhoud specimen in Morocco that's 300,000 years ago is an archaic Homo sapien, a near anatomically modern human, as is Homo sapiens idaltu, or the Hairtu man. the Florisbad man in South Africa. Again, a near anatomically modern human, an archaic Homo sapien. So is Homo kabish, the two Homo specimens in Ethiopia. Also, the creatures in the skull in the Kafka caves are near anatomically modern humans. And in all instances, the artifacts associated with these specimens is Middle Paleolithic. It's not Upper Paleolithic. It doesn't reflect, again, symbolism and the sophisticated behavior that is exclusive to anatomically and behaviorally modern humans in the archaeological record. And so why then would these evolutionary biologists argue that these are modern humans in the popular print? It's because of, again, viewing these creatures from an evolutionary standpoint, where the idea is that if you have a creature that is an archaic Homo sapiens, it is on a trajectory leading to modern humans, to Homo sapiens sapiens. And so they would argue that that evolutionary trajectory is indicating that modern humans must have evolved in independent parts of the world, again, eventually coalescing around a modern form. But this is, again, is in viewing the data from an evolutionary framework, from an evolutionary mindset, where you assume that if the evolutionary precursors are in these areas, this is where modern humans would have emerged as well. And so to refer to modern humans as being in Israel earlier than we thought, the understanding is that these creatures that were in Israel, this recent Mount Carmel find, the Kafsa and the Skull Cave finds mean that eventually modern humans would have emerged in that area of the world, and that humanity was outside of Africa earlier than we would have thought. So there's a logical consistency and a coherency that evolutionary biologists are presenting within their framework for why they would refer to modern humans being in Israel earlier than we thought, that humans left Africa earlier than we thought. So there's an internal logic that makes sense when you view this data from an evolutionary standpoint. Now, it reasons to believe, as part of our human origins model, the way that we view the hominins is that these were creatures that were biologically distinct from the descendants of Adam and Eve, which we would say would be anatomically and behaviorally modern humans, Homo sapiens sapiens. That they also were not only anatomically distinct, but behaviorally distinct as well. And that we would argue that these creatures existed for a period of time and they went extinct, that they had intelligence and emotional capability, but they lacked those qualities that we would understand reflect the image of God, the chief quality being symbolism. And as a result, while they may have displayed some intelligence and emotional capability, the artifacts that they would have produced would reflect limited cognitive abilities compared to, again, Homo sapiens sapiens. And so we could properly understand Homo sapiens idaltu, Homo kabish, the Jebu Irhoud specimen in Morocco, the skull and the Kafka cave site specimens, this Mount Carmel specimen, the Florisbad man as being distinct hominin species that lacked the imago Dei, that were, again, biologically and behaviorally distinct from humans. And so it all depends upon the worldview perspective that you bring to this data. If you bring an evolutionary worldview perspective to the data, then I think you could reasonably say that indeed humanity evolved in different parts of the world, parts of Africa, that there wasn't a single location, East Africa, in which humanity originates, and that humanity was indeed outside of Africa earlier than we thought. But if you're bringing a biblical perspective to this, and specifically the RTB model perspective, you would argue that these creatures are not evolutionary predecessors to humans, but simply creatures that God created that went extinct. And that the origin of modern humans is, again, in East Africa, very close to where we think the Garden of Eden would have been recently, in a way that's biblically compatible with the genealogies in Genesis 5 and 11. And that the mitochondrial Eve and Y-chromosomal Adam would be pointers to a biblical Adam and Eve. That, in other words, that when viewed from the RTB model perspective, these discoveries are completely consistent with the predictions that we would make given our understanding of the hominins within the context of our model, and that this does not represent a challenge to the RTB model for human origins or a biblical understanding of human origins. But this is a very important point. It depends upon the worldview in which you are interpreting the data. And the danger is to interpret the data within the context of one worldview and then import that interpretation into the context of a different worldview, and then argue that importing of an interpretation from one worldview to the other invalidates that the worldview in which you're importing the interpretation into. And so, again, worldview and perspective and philosophical presuppositions, theological presuppositions make a big difference. And so my point would be, again, this, that when we interpret these fossil finds within the context of a biblical worldview and within the framework of the RTB model, our model readily accommodates these discoveries and makes sense of them, again, based on the predictions that we would make. There's nothing in these discoveries that actually invalidate our predictions. And so those people who feel like this discovery is a challenge to the RTB human origins model are making the mistake of viewing the data from their worldview and then assuming that perspective now invalidates viewing the data from a biblical worldview, from a Christian worldview perspective. I really hope that this discussion has been helpful to you. I'm interested in hearing your perspective, your comments on this discovery, even if your perspective differs from mine. Also, I would ask again that you take a moment and react to the broadcast with the like button. This helps us to get greater visibility in the Facebook feed. And then also, again, take a moment and check in. Let us know who you are and where you're watching from. And I want to leave you with these closing thoughts, and that is this, that the more that we know about science, the more that we have reasons to believe. God bless you. I'll look forward to seeing you next time.